As the Saudi authorities clamp down on illegal immigrants, hundreds of foreign, mainly African workers are piled into buses in Riyadh to be taken to deportation centres. The campaign is aimed at reducing the black market in cheap foreign labour and creating more jobs for Saudis. Since the raids began last week, tension has flared. The authorities say that 3 Saudis and 2 foreigners have been killed in clashes. But those resisting are in the minority. More than 20,000 Ethiopians have reportedly handed themselves in, while at least 30,000 Yemenis are said to have left in the last 2 weeks. The crackdown comes after a 7-month amnesty that made changing visas easier. Now all foreign workers without the correct permits are being told to go. Before the campaign began, 9 million foreigners were estimated to be working in Saudi Arabia, making up a third of the population.
Clashes have erupted between police and demonstrators in southeastern Turkey following a mass rally against the construction of a wall between Turkey and Syria. Ankara says the structure is to provide security, but detractors say it is a divisive measure intended to separate Kurds in Syria from those in Turkey. Riot police beat back crowds with water cannon and tear gas, while demonstrators responded by detonating firecrackers. Earlier, some 5,000 people staged a demonstration on Turkey's border with Syria to support the mayor of the town of Nusaybin, who has launched a hunger strike protesting the wall. The construction site straddles Qasem and in Syria and Nusaybin in Turkey, both heavily populated by Kurds. Many have families on both sides of the frontier.
Turkish police fired tear gas and water cannons as anger erupts across the country following the death of a protester earlier in the day. Demonstrators used fireworks and flashed laser beams at the police. A 22-year-old died in the early hours of Tuesday during a demonstration in Hatay province in the south of the country. The cause of the young man's death was in dispute, with witnesses saying he was hit in the head. Police said he fell from a rooftop. Anti-government demonstrations have largely cooled since early July, but there have been sporadic protests in Istanbul, Ankara and Hatay.
Bulgarian police say they've made around 50 arrests in the wake of anti-government protests outside Parliament. The demonstrations continued on Wednesday, the day after clashes between police and students trying to blockade the building. 4 people were hurt and over 20 detained in Tuesday's confrontation. Protesters want to oust the socialist-backed technocrat government, claiming it has corrupt ties with business. This pensioner taking part said the younger generation was being suffocated by government policies. Look what happens. They want to kill the last young people who want to stay and live in Bulgaria, who want democracy. Membership of the EU has brought prosperity to many, but it's also encouraged lots of young Bulgarians to emigrate. Tuesday's protest was organised by students behind a sit-in at Sofia University. Now they're denouncing what they say was police violence. Authorities say a further 25 arrests were made on Wednesday morning in a special operation against antisocial behaviour.
Greek police are still searching for 10 illegal immigrants who escaped from a holding centre in Athens after a riot on Saturday night. A protest over the extension of their detention turned violent as inmates clashed with police and security guards. The detainees hurled water bottles and set fire to rubbish bags and mattresses. Greece, struggling to exit its worst financial crisis in decades, has become a frontier for immigrants, mainly from Asia and Africa, who seek a better life in Europe but often end up living in cramped detention centres.
Tension outside the ERT headquarters as occupying staff try to push through police lines. They're moved back, refused entry by officers who have now reclaimed the building. The operation began before dawn, riot police evicting ERT workers almost 5 months after it was shut down. Reports say some tear gas was used, but inside the building it was relatively peaceful. 20 or so staff were led out, a few who resisted briefly detained. Protesters have been gathering ever since, furious at what's happened.
From what I saw from the cameras, they broke the lock of the main entrance at 4:20 a.m. They started jumping in from the metal gates from the sides. They also broke the door of the side entrance. They started running inside.
They came in darkness so no one would be around and evicted colleagues. They have violated my life, democracy. They have destroyed everything. I will stay here. I refuse to leave.
Greece's national broadcaster was suddenly taken off air back in June. The government called it wasteful and corrupt. All 2,600 staff were sacked in a money-saving effort as the screens went to black. An interim replacement has been set up before a new, leaner, cheaper broadcaster is established next year. But it's been a chaotic transition as ERT has continued online, refusing to be silenced.
And so the standoff, peaceful for now, goes on. The government says it had to retake this building so the new broadcaster can move inside, but that won't placate people here. And so the question now is this: do Greeks still have the stomach for yet another fight? Mark Lowen, BBC News, Athens.
Bitter opponents of the controversial high-speed rail project between Italy and France. What started peacefully later erupted into violence on Rome's streets. Close to the French embassy, they clashed with police. But this isn't the first time. The project has been delayed for more than 2 decades due to huge opposition from locals and environmentalists. The route means tunnelling under the Alps.
Noi siamo tutti abitanti in Valle di Susa.
We are all inhabitants of the Susa Valley, where the train line is supposed to be built, and we've been fighting for 25 years against this useless and harmful public work.
It's no coincidence Wednesday's demonstrations came on the day French President François Hollande travelled to Rome for talks with Italy's Prime Minister Enrico Letta. They confirmed together that the high-speed rail link will be built.
Part of the funds that will be made available will go to the high-speed rail network. In 2014, a public tender will be contracted, so we imagine works will start at the end of 2014 or at the beginning of 2015.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, hundreds of demonstrators continue to rage into the evening. The clashes only slightly diffused by this protester in a wheelchair, pushed to the front. The cross-border train line will run from Lyon to Turin under the Alps. When complete, the 57-kilometre rail tunnel will become the longest in the world. 3,500 jobs are expected to be created from this project. And the cost? Well, the tunnel alone will cost 8.5 billion euros to complete. That's more than 11 billion US dollars. 40% of the budget will come from European taxpayers, the rest from Italy and France. There's hope the Lyon-Turin tunnel could further open rail travel in Europe, slashing journey times from London to Milan down to 6 hours. But opponents of the project say it's all a waste of money. The area already has 2 motorways and a railway line. Exploratory work on Italy's side began earlier this year, and now these latest announcements are clear indications of both countries' intentions to complete the project. Katerina Moe, BBC News.
Protesters demanding better housing rights in Italy have clashed with police in central Rome. Reports say at least 6 people, including 4 police officers, were slightly injured and taken to hospital. There were several arrests. As some demonstrators threw bottles, eggs and tried to mount an armoured vehicle, the police responded using batons and tear gas. Several hundred people, including a number of immigrants, had rallied in response to the call of a housing protest group. They demand the right to be housed and denounce forced evictions for unpaid rent. This activist said, "We believe the mayor of Rome should be banging his fists on the table today. He must absolutely insist on an end to the evictions of those who can't pay their rent." The minister responsible for housing has announced €140 million in aid for tenants in difficulty, but no changes in sight regarding evictions. Recent weeks have seen several protests linked to Italy's long recession.
Thousands of students in France are staging a second day of protest against the deportation of a Roma girl who was detained in front of her classmates on a school trip and expelled to Kosovo. In Paris, pupils blockaded the entrance to several schools, demanding the resignation of the Minister of the Interior, Manuel Valls, who has defended the expulsions and his tough policy towards Roma immigrants in general.
There are thousands of students out today, quite a surprising turnout. 14 high schools in the centre of Paris have been blockaded by students protesting at the return of Leonarda Di Brani. She's a 15-year-old Kosovan girl who is of Roma descent. She came here in 2009 with her family, and in that 4 years they've been applying for asylum. They say they suffer from xenophobia and discrimination in their home country, Kosovo. We understand that that application had been exhausted and rejected by the Interior Ministry. Earlier this month, she was on a school trip and the bus was stopped by police. She was dragged from the bus in front of her friends, taken to the airport and flown back with her 5 siblings and her mother back to Kosovo. Now, there's a great political row going on in the left now as to whether the law had been applied wrongly, and the Interior Minister says no, it hasn't. There had been due process, but there are those on the left who say, look, school should be off bounds for police. This shouldn't happen in front of other children. There were better ways to do it, and it's caused an intense reaction, particularly within the Socialist Party, as to the right sort of policy that should be followed with regards to illegal immigration and particularly the Roma.
French police clashed with angry demonstrators in Brittany on Saturday. They were protesting against a proposed tax on heavy goods vehicles, despite the government suspending plans for the tax during the week. Previous demonstrations by farmers and truckers in Brittany prompted the government's backpedalling on the controversial eco-tax. France is under pressure from European partners to reduce its public deficit. That has led to tax rises and fueled rising discontent. Opinion polls show François Hollande with the lowest approval rating of any French president on record.
First London, and a bonfire lit outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, with crowds wearing white masks involved with scuffles with police. There were similar scenes near Parliament too. Sarah Firth was there.
Trying to push back the protesters in this million mask march to let a car get through. There's been a lot of resistance from the protesters who are here. It's all about 1,000 people now on Parliament Square, possibly even more than that. It's been a large police operation, but faced with very, very angry protesters as they try and clear the roads. It's certainly not been the peaceful movement that the protesters said that it would be. Well, rather unexpectedly, the Million Mask March here in London has taken to London streets. They've moved from the Houses of Parliament where they were protesting, and they've walked right down onto the Mall here in London. If you look behind here, they're all walking down towards Buckingham Palace. Well, the Million Mask protesters here in London have ended up outside Buckingham Palace. We've had fireworks going off, some of them even making it across the gates. We've seen clashes break out tonight between police and protesters, and some of the groups splintering off, and as we said, coming all the way down here. Of course, this movement's been taking place in cities around the world tonight, but here in London, protesters ending the evening outside Buckingham Palace. Sarah Firth, RT, London.
These are the last moments of the final broadcast from Channel 9, a public TV station in Valencia, Spain, just before police evicted staff from its main studio and cut off the power. Some staff had occupied the studio defying a closure order from the regional government and continued broadcasting through the night. Over and over, they protest that this is a coup d'etat. Valencia's government took the decision to close the loss-making station in early November after losing a court battle to cut staff by more than a half. Founded in 1989, this is the first regional TV station to be closed down as Spain's austerity measures bite. In the last few seconds, a journalist tried to make a live broadcast via his mobile phone. But just then, technicians under the guidance of police pulled the plug on the live broadcast, leaving viewers seeing black. Pablo Esparza, BBC News.
It was the final straw for some in Portugal as Parliament passed the 2014 budget, paving the way for more cuts. Austerity-weary trade unionists occupied government ministries in protest. Public sector workers are set to face salary cuts of up to 12%, as well as reductions to their pensions. I'm nearing retirement, and after 40 years of working, I don't think I'll have enough of a pension to live on. It's really borderline. Some marched to Parliament denouncing what will be a third straight year of austerity. The government says cuts are inevitable as it struggles to reduce the deficit, but many on the sharp end are not convinced. They drive people to despair, suicide and starvation. It can't go on like this. This is not what the people wanted. The opposition has vowed to challenge some measures in the Constitutional Court, but the ruling centre-right coalition is determined to satisfy Portugal's international lenders and avoid having to ask for a second bailout. Even in the public gallery, though, some put up a protest.
The headquarters of the Islamist Ennahda party in Gafsa in central Tunisia went up in flames on Wednesday as violence flared around the country. 3 Tunisian regions were paralysed by general strikes as anger about regional wealth disparities boiled over. A complaint that drove the 2011 revolution. Many feel the new government's done nothing.
It's almost 7 weeks since these school teachers began their strike. But their anger has in no way diminished and they feel increasingly desperate. This week has been particularly violent. Clashes break out in the late afternoon outside the City Hall in Rio de Janeiro's busy business district. Some have been camping here for weeks. Tensions escalate over a benefits package scheduled to be voted on inside. It offers lower salaries than the teachers want and limits benefits to those working less than 40 hours a week.
We are told that teachers have rights, but in fact we don't have any. To do our 40-hour week, we have to work in many schools. We can no longer accept being humiliated like that.
Teachers aren't violent, they don't have weapons or bombs. We're only here to ask for a better education in this city.
As night falls over the city, riot police firing tear gas and rubber bullets pursue protesters through the streets. Stones and homemade explosives are thrown back. This is the second day in a row that protests have erupted into violence. The teachers' unions say they'll continue to strike until their demands are met. Demonstrations for social change have gathered momentum across the country in recent months. Many want the government to spend less on hosting sporting events and more on education and health services. Elaine Jung, BBC News.
Mais de 200 cães de uma clínica em São Roque, no interior de São Paulo. A empresa usa os animais em testes para a indústria farmacêutica.
Várias pessoas invadiram a clínica. A manifestação aconteceu durante a madrugada em São Roque, numa empresa que faz testes químicos em animais, o Instituto Royal.
Olha isso aqui, ó. Tudo verdade.
É uma vida.
É uma vida.
Um a um, vários cachorros da raça Beagle são tirados de lá. Os manifestantes disseram que pelo menos 200 animais foram resgatados. Mas essas imagens mostram vários cachorros que não tiveram a mesma sorte.
Todo congelado, né? Nitrogênio líquido.
Eles estão congelados com nitrogênio para futuros testes. Os animais são usados...
Hoje em São Paulo, ativistas pelos direitos dos animais entraram em confronto com a Polícia Militar no município de São Roque. O protesto ocorreu hoje pela manhã na rodovia Raposo Tavares, interior de São Paulo. Os manifestantes acusam o Instituto Royal de maltratar cães da raça Beagle, ratos e outros animais usados em pesquisas laboratoriais. Os ativistas bloquearam os 2 sentidos da rodovia e queriam se aproximar da sede do Instituto. Os policiais usaram bombas de efeito moral para dispersar o grupo. Houve também depredação. Alguns manifestantes colocaram fogo em veículos da Polícia Militar e da imprensa. 7 pessoas foram detidas, 4 delas presas por danos ao patrimônio público. Na madrugada de sexta-feira, um grupo de ativistas retirou 178 cachorros da raça Beagle do laboratório do Instituto. O local é uma OICIP, Organização Social de Interesse Público, e usa animais como cobaias para testes. Em nota, a Sociedade Brasileira para o Progresso da Ciência informou que o Instituto Royal realiza estudos de avaliação de risco e segurança de novos medicamentos e que os experimentos estão de acordo com os protocolos internacionais e atendem às normas da Agência Nacional de Vigilância Sanitária, a Anvisa.
In Chile, dozens of protesters have been arrested after clashes broke out with police on the 40th anniversary of the 1973 military coup. Police used water cannon and fired tear gas as protesters threw stones and erected barricades. In Santiago, a bus was set alight and 8,000 extra police officers were drafted in to maintain order. During the 17 years of the Pinochet regime, around 40,000 people were arrested and tortured, and more than 3,000 were killed, their bodies often dumped at sea or buried in unmarked graves. More than 1,000 civil rights cases dating from the Pinochet regime are still going through the courts. Her story is still alive and continues in this stadium because we have not yet reached the truth. In the meantime, this open wound doesn't heal, and that's why we're here, because I think it's important that we make it clear that we do this every year. The country remains divided over Pinochet's legacy. Although most people deplore his human rights record, a minority believe that Pinochet saved the country from poverty and civil war.
Rocks strewn across the ground and tires set on fire as farmers block roads in protest. And riot police respond with tear gas. These clashes took place in the central Bolivian department of Cochabamba. Protesters were demanding more funding following the results of a census which showed a growth in the number of people living in the rural area. Farmers accused police of being heavy-handed. This demonstrator maintained they were just standing up for their rights. Recently, Bolivia has been rocked by a series of protests sparked by funding allocations. In Bolivia, one of the poorest countries of South America, cuts in funding are often equated with less food on the table for millions of families living below the poverty line. Bruno Garcês, BBC News.
This is what greeted Colombian farmers when they arrived in the capital. Thousands of them, many in woolen ponchos, converged on Bogota after 11 days of protest over trade tariffs they say are impacting their ability to make a living.
How can we be importing potatoes when we are the largest potato producers in Latin America? That is absurd and is only possible because of Santos' government.
Potato, corn, and milk producers complain that free trade agreements with Europe and the U.S. have made it almost impossible to compete with cheaper imports. So far, President Juan Manuel Santos says he will lift import duties on 23 products to help lower crop production costs. It isn't clear at this point whether it will be enough to help farmers and end the protest and labor strike that has consumed Colombia and has already resulted in 1 death and scores of injuries and arrests.
This is not the way the government wanted the Independence Day weekend to begin. After weeks camped out in protest at a government education reform, hundreds of teachers were removed, many by force, from the capital's main square, the Zócalo. Earlier, the government had imposed a deadline for them to leave, a day before thousands of revellers are due to descend on the square. Most left voluntarily, but some stayed. They were met by scores of riot police using tear gas and water cannon to clear the Zócalo. Overhead, Black Hawk helicopters had been deployed, while on the streets there were injuries on both sides as protesters clashed with the police. More than 30 people were arrested as the police rounded up anyone who was left in the square after the deadline fell. It is thought that some of the demonstrators, throwing stones and petrol bombs, were radical anti-government activists, not necessarily associated with the teachers' union. Either way, this is not the image of Mexican unity the government had hoped for on what is Enrique Peña Nieto's first Independence Day as president. So far, his has been a presidency marked by social protest in response to a series of reforms he is determined to enforce. However, it seems his opponents are equally determined to make their point heard. Will Grant, BBC News, Mexico.
This is the National Independence Day holiday, but the mood in Port-au-Prince has been far from celebratory. Determination is rising to see President Michel Martelly step down. Protesters threw rocks, riot police used tear gas, and shots were fired. Thousands swarmed through the streets, the crowd swelling as they passed each neighbourhood, their resolve growing. They say the cost of living is too high and there's too much corruption. Fueling their anger, local and legislative elections are now 2 years overdue.
What we want is the departure of Michel Martelly. He can no longer govern the country. He is an idiot, a president that has no respect for the country. We would like his departure.
Chronic instability and natural disasters have left Haiti the poorest nation in the Americas, and development is being held back by political volatility and civil unrest. This is just the latest in a series of protests against the president in recent weeks, but it's probably the largest to be held since he took office in 2011. Troops were dispatched by the UN peacekeeping mission to restore order. There are still more than 8,000 peacekeepers here, 9 years after they were called in following an uprising. That mission has recently been extended until October next year. The Security Council says building the capacity of the National Police remains a most critical task. Emily Thomas, BBC News.
Se quiten la corbata y le den los derechos que tenemos los trabajadores, que son muy abusadores y explotadores. ¡Fuera la gerencia! ¡Fuera la gerencia! ¡Que nos den nuestras 40 horas! ¡Que trabajamos mucho! ¡Y son muy explotadores! Hacemos el trabajo de 3 y 4 personas y con todo eso nos quitan las horas. Eso es un abuso, nos están reventando aquí. Y somos personas de familia que tenemos que mantener hijos. Y nos revientan y nos quitan las horas, abusadores.
Mi nombre es Ramón Almanza y empezamos la huelga porque es un abuso que tiene lo de la gerencia de Walmart con los asociados. Nos dan 34, 35 horas semanal, nos ponen a trabajar, que un solo hombre haga el trabajo de 5 hombres. Entonces hay mucho favoritismo Le dan 40 horas a algunos, a otros no. Y ellos siempre nos están amenazando. Todos estamos trabajando bajo amenaza. Eso es todo.
News crew captured the pandemonium spilling into downtown Durham. An estimated 300 people storming the perimeter of police headquarters, among them some of Jesus Horta's loved ones.
To just remember his memory. That's it, and justice for him. We just came in peace to do the justice march for my brother. That's about it.
But things quickly got out of hand. Looks like one protester threw a hammer through a squad car window. They also shattered several of the police station's windows while shouting expletives toward law enforcement and holding signs saying they want justice for Chewy, Horta's name.
They're not willing to give out the truth, so we came in demanding answers. We want them to tell us the truth. We came in solidarity with the family, and it just turned into a whole fiasco.
Their protest comes the same day Durham Police Chief Jose Lopez issued a statement defending his decision to release few details about the former Riverside High School student. Police arrested Horta for trespassing and had just arrived at the station's parking lot when sources tell Eyewitness News the teen shot himself. Police policy should ensure prisoners taken into custody don't have weapons. The SBI now investigating, and the chief sounding annoyed. We asked why he hasn't been more forthcoming.
It's going to take a while. It's not done overnight. It gets a little frustrating when you continue to hear it from people who already know that when they ask you, so where's the investigation, that you can't answer to it.